Well, hey guys, it's Dr. Austin Perlmutter. In this video, I want to continue my set of mini lectures on ways that the outside world gets inside, and specifically, how does the outside world change our brains such that we then have different thoughts, different actions, and different emotions. If you've been following my previous work, you know that one of the things I'm very interested in is the interfaces with the outside world and the inside world. And certainly one of our biggest and most important interfaces is the gut. So we talked before about the gut barrier and how things like secretory IgA and antimicrobial peptide help to keep the outside world out. Today I want to talk about the gut microbiome and the major role that it plays in changing our cognition. Okay, so when I say gut microbiome, I want to be very clear because in general, when people talk about microbiome or the microbiome, they are referring to the gut microbiome. But the body has a bunch of different microbiomes. There's a lung microbiome, there's a skin microbiome, and one of those is the gut. And the microbiome specifically actually is comprised of bacteria and fungi and archaea and viruses. So it's not all about the bacteria, but when people talk about the gut microbiome, or the microbiome, they're generally referring to bacteria that live in the gut. And that is actually the subject of this lecture. So if I say microbiome, that's what I'm referring to. Okay, so how does this gut microbiome get populated in life? Well, it was thought for a long time that the womb was sterile and that the gut microbiome was populated at childbirth. But it's recently come to light that there may be bacteria in the amniotic fluid. There may be bacterial transfer through the placenta. And we're not really sure what that might mean, but it is something worth keeping in mind because it certainly sets back, or I should say, moves backwards our timeline as to when these microbes might be making their way into an infant's GI tract. What we do know is that during childbirth, and depending on the route of childbirth, there are different microbes that are introduced into the infant's GI tract. And this tends to be very important because depending on whether the child is born through cesarean or through vaginal birth, it can actually influence longer-term health outcomes. Okay, so now that the child has their initial colonization, what happens? Well, depending on whether that child is exposed to breast milk or other types of foods, there are actually changes in the gut microbiome again. So there are a whole lot of factors early on in life that could influence the way that the gut microbiome is populated. Why that's so important is because not only does the gut microbiome influence a whole bunch of disease states, but what we know is that early in life, our brains are developing very quickly. And we know that the gut microbiome is actually essential in enabling our brains to develop in a healthy way. So those early life experiences that imprint our microbiome are actually also going to have a significant role in determining how our brains function. Okay, so we talked about how the gut microbiome gets started. It's also worthwhile to consider the fact that our genome, the human genome, is several orders of magnitude smaller than the gut microbiome, or I should say the human microbiome. And that means that we actually contain far more genes from bacteria and other bugs than we contain human genes. And why that's important is because the human genes are affected by gut genes by way of the epigenome. So when gut bacteria produce metabolites like short-chain fatty acids, those short-chain fatty acids actually work on our epigenome to influence the expression of our genes. It's a whole lot of details, but it's really interesting to think about because what you realize is that our hologenome, which is the sum total of all the genes and the influences between them, is actually comprised of more than just the genes that we possess and what is in our own DNA. Okay, so now let's take this a step further and talk about what is the microbiome doing for us and how does that then influence our brain health. So the microbiome has several different important roles. As it relates to how it affects us, it has immunologic roles, it has metabolic roles, it affects our cognition. At a very basic level, the gut microbiome helps to maintain that gut barrier. So these gut epithelial cells, or enterocytes, use the byproducts of gut microbiome metabolism to stay strong. Those short-chain fatty acids that gut microbes produce are used by these gut enterocytes or epithelial cells as fuel. And when those cells are strong, when they're well fed, they're able to maintain the barrier and keep out bad bugs and other antigens. We also know that the gut microbiome is strongly involved with our metabolism. So these short-chain fatty acids produced by these gut bacteria as a response to their consumption of fiber, those include acetate and propionate, and both of those are involved with things like lipogenesis and gluconeogenesis, which are key metabolic processes. And then probably the most important, or at least interesting, of the effects of this gut microbiome for me is that it influences our immune cells. So we know that these gut microbes can influence things like our T regulatory cells, which are critically important in enabling us to fend off conditions like autoimmunity and atopy, like things like asthma. We also know that the gut microbiome interfaces with our microglial cells, which are our immune cells in our brain. And then at a little bit more local level, we know that the gut microbiome helps to defend our gut from pathogens and antigens by providing food to enterocytes, like I already said, and building up our gut wall, but also by helping our gut's immune cells to produce secretory IgA. So in essence, these gut microbes tell our gut immune cells, here's what's going on and here's how to counter it. So they're able to adapt to changes in our environment. Okay, so how does the gut microbiome overlap with various immune states? Well, we know that the microbes have shown to be dysregulated, or I should say modified, in conditions like obesity. We know that they are associated with things like insulin resistance. We know that they are associated with things like inflammatory bowel disease, as well as irritable bowel syndrome. And perhaps most germane to this conversation, we're now learning that the microbiome is changed in conditions of depression and anxiety. So that tells us that the gut microbiome is influencing our brains. How does it possibly do this? The gut microbiome is way down here in our belly, and our brain is way up here. How does that signal get to the brain? So in this video, I'm just going to go over at a very basic level the routes through which that signal can reach the central nervous system. In further videos, we'll go through the mechanisms and we'll go through more details. But I want you to basically understand that there are two major routes through which signals from our gut and from the gut microbiome can reach our brain. One is through the circulatory system, through our blood. So that means anything that comes out through the gut that gets into our bloodstream has the possibility of going up and either through active transport, passive transport, or breaks in the blood-brain barrier, it can get through the blood-brain barrier and influence our brain. And there are other ways that it can get through from the blood to the brain as well. There are other barriers in the brain. But I just want you to understand that when things get into the bloodstream from the gut, because they get absorbed from the gut into the bloodstream, those can then reach and influence the brain. The other way that may not be immediately obvious is actually through nerves. What we know is that the vagus nerve comes down from the brain, and then it actually has all of these fibers that go into the gut. It turns out that there are many more fibers going from the gut to the brain than from the brain to the gut, which was not something that I knew before I looked into this. And why is that so important? It's because those fibers are sensing what's going on in the gut and transmitting that message to the brain. So in some ways, it's actually picking up the signal directly from the gut microbiome and bringing that up to the brain. And in other ways, it's picking up secondary signals. So it might be breakdown products of some of those bacteria, things like lipopolysaccharide, which is a component of gram-negative bacteria, or it might be secondary molecules like those short-chain fatty acids, which are metabolites of these gut bacteria that can be sensed by and then transported up in this nerve, the vagus nerve, to then influence brain function. So as I mentioned in further videos, I want to get into more details as to how those signals then influence the brain. I think the microglial microbiome overlap is absolutely fascinating, but there's a lot to talk about there. So if this was interesting to you, let me know, and I look forward to speaking with you soon.